It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in Chicago, the kind where autumn had just begun painting the city with red and gold leaves. President Trump's motorcade rolled through downtown, flanked by police motorcycles and black SUVs filled with elite Secret Service agents. The president sat in his armored Cadillac one, known as the Beast, reviewing notes for his upcoming speech at a business conference. Looking up from his papers, Trump glanced out the window at the passing streets. The motorcade slowed at a red light, and that's when he noticed her, an elderly woman huddled in the doorway of a closed-down storefront. She wore layers of warm clothing despite the mild weather, a woolen cap pulled down to her ears. Next to her stood a shopping cart containing what looked like everything she owned: plastic bags, a rolled blanket, and a small American flag poking out from the side. Something about her caught the president's attention. Perhaps it was the way she sat with her back straight despite her circumstances, or how she nodded politely to passers-by who largely ignored her. Trump tapped on the partition separating him from his driver. "Who's that woman over there?" he asked his chief of staff, pointing toward the doorway. "Just a homeless person, sir. We'll be at the venue in about 10 minutes. Trump continued watching as the light turned green. The woman was now pulling something from her pocket, a faded photograph that she gazed at with obvious affection. As the motorcade began moving again, Trump made a sudden decision. "Stop the car," he said. His chief of staff looked up in surprise. "Sir?" "I said stop the car, right here." The lead Secret Service agent turned around from the front seat. "Mr. President, that's not in the protocol. We're on a tight schedule, and we haven't secured this area for an unplanned stop." "I understand that," Trump replied, his voice firm. "But I want to speak with that woman. Something's telling me to stop." The agent spoke urgently into his wrist microphone while exchanging concerned glances with the others in the vehicle. After a moment of tense back and forth, the motorcade gradually slowed to a halt, causing confusion among the police escorts and press vans following behind. 2 minutes, sir," the agent conceded reluctantly. "That's all we can safely allow." Trump nodded as agents spilled out of the surrounding vehicles, quickly forming a protective perimeter around the area. Pedestrians stopped in their tracks, pulling out phones to record the unexpected scene unfolding before them. When the president's door opened, a ripple of whispers spread through the gathering crowd. Trump stepped onto the sidewalk, straightened his tie, and walked directly toward the elderly woman who hadn't yet realized what was happening. She looked up as the wall of suited men approached, confusion and a hint of fear crossing her weathered face. Her eyes widened when she recognized who was walking toward her. "Good morning," Trump said, stopping a few feet from her doorway. Good morning, Mr. President," she stammered, attempting to stand. "Please, don't get up," Trump said, gesturing for her to stay seated. "What's your name?" "Helen," she replied, her voice stronger now despite her obvious surprise. "Helen Thompson. It's nice to meet you, Helen. Do you mind if I ask why you're out here today?" Helen hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "Well, sir, this is where I stay these days. My husband John was a helicopter mechanic in Vietnam. After he passed 3 years ago, the medical bills took everything. The VA benefits got tangled up somewhere, and I've been waiting on appeals." Trump listened intently, nodding occasionally. The Secret Service agents exchanged glances as their earpieces buzzed with concerned chatter about the unplanned stop extending beyond the agreed time limit. "How long have you been on the street, Helen?" Trump asked, seemingly oblivious to his agent's growing anxiety. "Coming up on 8 months now," she replied, then held up the photograph she'd been looking at earlier. "That's my John there. 46 years we were married." Trump took the offered photo, studying the image of a young man in military uniform standing proudly beside a younger Helen. In the background, bystanders had formed a ring around the scene, phones raised high to capture this unprecedented moment. "Helen," Trump said, handing back the photograph, "no veteran's widow should be living on the street. Not in America. Not on my watch." The Secret Service agents shifted uncomfortably as Trump continued his conversation with Helen. This was far from standard protocol. The lead agent leaned in and whispered urgently, "Mr. President, we need to get moving. This is a security risk." Trump held up his hand, silently asking for more time. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, with people pressing forward to witness this unexpected scene. "I want to help you, Helen," Trump said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "What you're going through isn't right." The chief of staff, who had exited the vehicle and now stood nearby, looked increasingly nervous. He checked his watch and whispered to an aide about the schedule they were now throwing into disarray. "Sir," he called out, "the business leaders are waiting. We really should." "They can wait," Trump replied firmly, not taking his eyes off Helen. "This is more important right now." Helen looked overwhelmed by the attention. "Mr. President, I don't want to cause any trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Trump assured her. "Tell me more about these VA benefits. What happened exactly?" As Helen began explaining the bureaucratic maze she'd been trapped in since her husband's death, Trump motioned for his chief of staff to come closer. "Get someone on the phone from Veterans Affairs," he said quietly, "right now, and find out which local shelters have space available today." The chief of staff nodded and stepped away, phone already at his ear. Meanwhile, the crowd had grown so large that local police were redirecting traffic. News vans were pulling up, reporters scrambling with cameras and microphones. One of Trump's aides approached with a notepad, jotting down Helen's information as she continued her story. She explained how after her husband's cancer diagnosis, they'd quickly gone through their savings. After his death, paperwork issues had prevented her from receiving the benefits she was entitled to. 3 different times they told me to resubmit, Helen said, frustration evident in her voice. Each time it was because something different was missing or incorrect. Eventually, I couldn't keep up with the rent payments. Trump listened, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The annoyance on his face grew visible as Helen described visiting the VA office 6 times in person, only to be told to come back another day. "This isn't how we should treat our veterans or their families," Trump said, loud enough for the nearby press to hear. "Not acceptable, not at all." His chief of staff returned, speaking in hushed tones. Trump nodded, then turned back to Helen. "Helen, I've got people working on your situation right now. But first things first, you can't spend another night out here." He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to her. "This has my direct office number. My staff is arranging temporary housing for you today, and we're going to sort out those benefits." Helen's hands trembled as she took the card. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Trump replied. "Your husband served our country. The least we can do is make sure you're taken care of properly." He glanced at his chief of staff, who held up a phone. "We've got the director of the Chicago VA on the line, sir." Trump nodded, then turned back to Helen. "Is it all right if some of my staff help you gather your things? There's a car coming that will take you somewhere safe and warm today." Helen looked at her shopping cart, then back at the president. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Trump confirmed. "And I'm going to make some calls personally to make sure your case gets reviewed immediately." A black SUV pulled up alongside the motorcade. 2 female agents approached, speaking gently to Helen as they helped her collect her belongings. Trump watched for a moment, then addressed the gathered crowd, which had fallen strangely quiet. "This shouldn't happen in America," he said, his voice carrying without effort. "Our veterans deserve better. Their families deserve better, and we're going to fix it." Phones captured his every word as he continued. "This isn't about politics. This is about doing what's right. When I see something wrong, I can't just drive by." As Helen was helped into the waiting SUV, Trump approached her one last time. "I'll check in on you personally to make sure everything gets resolved," he promised. Helen reached out and briefly grasped his hand. "Thank you," she said simply, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Trump nodded, then returned to his vehicle as the crowd broke into spontaneous applause. Within minutes, the motorcade was moving again, but the story of what had just happened was already spreading across social media at lightning speed. As the business conference attendees waited inside the grand ballroom of the Chicago Plaza Hotel, whispers spread through the crowd. The president was late, and rumors of an unscheduled stop were already circulating. When Trump finally took the stage 20 minutes behind schedule, the audience rose in polite applause, unaware of what had transpired on the streets outside. "Good morning," Trump began, adjusting the microphone. "I apologize for my lateness. Sometimes life presents us with unexpected moments that can't be ignored." He paused, seeming to consider whether to continue with his prepared remarks or address what had just happened. Making a decision, he set his speech notes aside. On my way here, I met an American who changed my morning, and I suspect will change many more mornings to come. Trump's voice grew more serious. I met a woman named Helen, the widow of a Vietnam veteran, living on our streets because of paperwork and bureaucracy. The room fell silent as Trump recounted the brief encounter. His usual bombastic style was subdued, replaced by a thoughtful tone that caught many in the audience by surprise. We talk about economic growth, tax policies, and international trade, he continued, but what good is any of it if we can't ensure our veterans and their families are properly cared for? This woman's husband served our country, and yet she sleeps in a doorway while her benefits are tied up in red tape. A phone buzzed in Trump's pocket. He checked it briefly, then looked back up with a slight smile. I've just been informed that Helen has arrived safely at a veterans transitional housing center. My team is already working with VA officials to expedite her case. The crowd applauded, more enthusiastically this time. Trump launched into his prepared speech about economic policy, but throughout his remarks, he kept returning to Helen's story, using it to emphasize different points. Meanwhile, across town, Helen sat in a small but clean room at the Veterans Center, still trying to process what had happened. A kind-faced woman had helped her settle in, bringing her a hot meal and fresh clothes. Is this really happening? Helen asked as she sipped her first cup of coffee in days. Yes, ma'am, the center director replied. We received calls from the highest levels. Your situation is being reviewed right now by the regional VA director personally. Helen's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the sandwich on her tray. I never expected. Who would think the president would just stop his car like that? It's certainly unprecedented, the director agreed. And it seems to be causing quite a stir. Indeed, across the city and beyond, Helen's story was spreading rapidly. Local news crews were already gathered outside the Veterans Center, hoping for a glimpse of the woman who had caught the president's attention. Social media was exploding with video clips of the encounter, some already viewed millions of times. At a nearby coffee shop, a group of friends watched the footage on a laptop. I can't believe he just stopped the motorcade like that, one said. That's not something presidents typically do. Security nightmare, another commented. Those Secret Service agents must have been having heart attacks. Whatever you think of his politics, a third added, you have to admit it took guts to break protocol like that. Back at the conference, Trump was concluding his speech when an aide approached with a note. He read it quickly, then returned to the microphone. I've just been informed that the Department of Veterans Affairs has located Helen's file. It turns out her benefits were approved months ago, but the notification was sent to an old address after she lost her home. Trump shook his head, his frustration evident. This is exactly the kind of government inefficiency that drives me crazy. Real people suffer because of paperwork mistakes. The audience murmured in agreement as Trump continued. I'm told that by this afternoon, Helen will have access to the back pay she's entitled to, as well as ongoing monthly benefits. But here's what bothers me. How many other Helens are out there? How many other veteran families are falling through the cracks because of bureaucratic mistakes? Trump's voice grew stronger as he departed from his prepared remarks entirely. I'm directing my staff to conduct an immediate review of how the VA processes benefits for veterans' surviving spouses. This isn't a Democratic or Republican issue. This is an American issue. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Trump acknowledged it with a nod, then raised his hands to quiet them. I came here today to talk about business and the economy. But sometimes the most important business is taking care of our own. The strongest economy means nothing if we can't provide for those who sacrificed for our country. As he stepped away from the podium, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Trump waved them off, already deep in conversation with his staff about the next steps in Helen's case. For her part, Helen sat on the edge of her bed in the Veterans Center, looking at an old photograph of her husband in uniform. You wouldn't believe what happened today, John, she whispered. I think someone finally heard us. By late afternoon, Helen's story had grown from local news to a national sensation. Cable news networks played the video footage on loop, the President of the United States stepping out of his armored vehicle to speak with a homeless veteran's widow. Political analysts debated his motivations, but the public reaction was overwhelmingly positive across both sides of the political divide. At the Veterans Center, Helen was overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Her phone, a basic model provided by the center staff, rang constantly with interview requests. Outside, reporters camped at the entrance, hoping for a statement or photo. "I never wanted all this fuss," Helen told the center director as they watched the news coverage together. "I was just trying to survive each day." "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns," the director replied, patting Helen's hand. "But this attention might help other veterans in similar situations." Helen nodded slowly. "Then maybe some good can come from it all." Around 5 p.m., a representative from the VA arrived with a thick folder of documents and a check representing 6 months of back benefits. Helen's hands shook as she signed the paperwork, hardly believing this rapid resolution after months of being ignored. "The President's office has been calling every 30 minutes for updates," the VA representative explained apologetically. "They want to make sure everything is handled properly." "Please thank them for me," Helen said softly. "I still can't believe he stopped his car just because he saw me sitting there." Across town, Trump was finishing his scheduled appearances for the day when his chief of staff approached with an update. "Helen's immediate situation has been resolved, sir. The VA delivered her back benefits and has arranged for permanent housing assistance." Trump nodded approvingly. "Good. And what about the broader issue? How many other veterans' spouses are in similar situations?" "Initial reports suggest it's a significant problem, sir. The VA estimates thousands of cases may be delayed or mishandled." Trump's expression darkened. "That's unacceptable. I want a task force assembled by tomorrow morning. We need to identify and fix these cases immediately." "Yes, sir." And there's something else. The press response has been overwhelming. Every major network wants an interview about what happened today. Trump waved away the suggestion. "This isn't about me or getting press. It's about fixing a broken system. Schedule a call with Helen instead. I want to check on her personally." 20 minutes later, Helen was startled when her new phone rang again. "Hello. Helen, this is President Trump. I'm calling to see how you're doing." Helen nearly dropped the phone in surprise. "Mr. President, I'm much better, thank you. They've been taking good care of me here." "I'm glad to hear it. I understand the VA has processed your benefits." "Yes, sir. It happened so fast, after months of nothing." There was a pause, then Trump spoke again, his voice serious. "That's the problem, Helen. Things shouldn't happen only when the president gets involved. Every veteran's family deserves proper treatment." "I couldn't agree more," Helen replied. "John would be so upset knowing what happened to us." "Tell me about John," Trump said, surprising Helen with a personal question. "What kind of man was he?" For the next few minutes, Helen shared stories of her late husband, his dedication to service, his sense of humor, his struggle with illness in his final years. Trump listened quietly, occasionally asking questions that showed he was genuinely engaged. "He sounds like a fine American," Trump said when Helen finished. "The kind of citizen who makes this country great." "He was," Helen agreed, wiping away a tear. "Thank you for listening to his story. Helen, I'd like to ask you something. Would you be willing to help us identify and fix problems in the VA system? Your experience could help prevent others from facing the same difficulties." Helen sat up straighter. "I would be honored, Mr. President." "Good. My staff will be in touch. And Helen, get some rest. Tomorrow will be a new beginning." After they hung up, Helen sat quietly for a long moment. Then she reached for her husband's photograph again. "Can you believe it, John? The president wants my help. Maybe all this wasn't for nothing after all." Outside the Veterans Center, the crowd of reporters had doubled in size as word spread of Trump's personal call. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing aerial footage of the growing scene. Inside the presidential limousine heading back to Air Force One, Trump stared thoughtfully out the window. His political advisors were already discussing how to leverage the day's events, but Trump seemed focused on something else entirely. "Sir," his chief of staff ventured, "the polls are already showing a positive response to today's events." Trump nodded absently. "Good, but that's not the point. Schedule a meeting with the VA secretary for tomorrow morning. First thing, we have work to do." As darkness fell over Chicago, two different worlds had been irrevocably connected. In a small room at the Veterans Center, Helen prepared for her first night in a real bed in months. And aboard Air Force One, the president began drafting notes for a new veterans initiative inspired by a chance encounter that morning. The next morning, news outlets across America led with Helen's story. Breakfast shows featured political commentators, veterans advocates, and social workers all weighing in on the unexpected moment that had captured the nation's attention. Some praised the president's compassion, while others questioned whether this was merely a publicity stunt. But regardless of political leaning, everyone was talking about Helen. In a Washington, D.C. conference room, Trump sat at the head of a hastily assembled task force. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs looked nervous as he presented the preliminary findings of an overnight review. "Mr. President, our initial assessment confirms systematic problems in how we process benefits for veterans' surviving spouses. The backlog is substantial." Trump leaned forward, tapping his finger on the table. "Give me numbers, not descriptions." The secretary swallowed hard. Approximately 4,300 cases are currently delayed beyond the acceptable processing window. Of those, at least 600 appear to involve situations similar to Helen's, where benefits were approved but notification failures occurred. So nearly 600 people who served our country have family members potentially facing homelessness because of paperwork mistakes. Trump's voice was quiet but intense. That's a fair assessment, sir." Trump stood up suddenly, causing several advisers to straighten in their chairs. "This ends now. I want every one of those 600 cases resolved within 72 hours. Bring in additional staff, authorize overtime, whatever it takes." "Sir, with all due respect, our systems aren't designed to." "I don't want to hear about system limitations," Trump interrupted. "Helen spent 8 months on the street because your systems aren't designed properly. Fix the systems." Meanwhile, in Chicago, Helen woke up in a real bed for the first time in months. The Veterans Center had arranged for a small apartment within their transitional housing complex. Simple but clean, with actual privacy and security. She sat on the edge of her bed, still trying to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. A gentle knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. The center director stood there with a tablet in hand. "Good morning, Helen. Did you sleep well?" Helen nodded. "Better than I have in a very long time." "I'm glad to hear it. There's something I think you should see." The director handed Helen the tablet, which displayed a major news website. The headline read, "Presidencial Directive. Trump orders immediate action on veterans' widows' benefits." Helen stayed at the screen in disbelief. The article detailed an emergency order signed that morning, directing the VA to resolve all backlogged spousal benefit cases within 3 days. "He really meant it," Helen whispered. "There's more," the director said, scrolling down to show another article. "They're calling it the Helen Thompson Initiative, a proposed overhaul of how the VA processes benefits for veterans' families." Helen's eyes filled with tears. All this because he happened to look out his window at the right moment. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments," the director replied. By midday, Helen had received a formal invitation to attend a White House press conference the following week. The president wanted her there as he announced the new initiative. "I can't go to the White House," Helen protested when she received the call. "I don't have proper clothes or anything." "Mrs. Thompson," the caller replied kindly, "the president specifically requested your presence. And please don't worry about clothes or travel arrangements. Everything will be taken care of." As Helen considered this unexpected turn of events, her story continued spreading. Veterans groups across the country held rallies supporting the president's actions. On social media, the hashtag Helen Effect was trending as people shared stories of other veterans falling through bureaucratic cracks. Back in Washington, the VA task force worked through the night, processing backlogged cases at unprecedented speed. By evening, over 200 cases had been resolved, with benefits payments already dispatched to the affected families. Trump received an update during his evening briefing. "We're making progress, sir, but some of these cases are complicated. The 72-hour deadline will be challenging." Trump removed his reading glasses and fixed the staffer with a steady gaze. When Helen was sitting in that doorway, was it challenging for her? When she was hungry, was that challenging? We make this happen, no excuses. Later that night, Trump called Helen again, this time to personally invite her to Washington. I don't know what to say, Helen admitted. I never expected any of this. Sometimes unexpected things turn out to be the most important, Trump replied. Your story is helping thousands of people, Helen. Will you help us make this change permanent by coming to Washington? After a moment of thought, Helen straightened her shoulders, an echo of the dignity that had first caught Trump's attention. Yes, Mr. President. For John, and for all the others like us, I'll be there. As she hung up the phone, Helen looked around her small apartment. 24 hours earlier, she had been huddled in a doorway, invisible to most of the world. Now her name was becoming synonymous with veterans' rights reform. The world had indeed been shocked, not just by a president who stopped his motorcade, but by the human story that had been waiting to be heard all along. The following Monday morning, Helen stood nervously in front of a mirror in a hotel suite in Washington, D.C. A professional stylist had helped her select a simple navy blue dress and matching jacket. Her silver hair had been neatly styled, and a touch of makeup brightened her face. Looking at her reflection, Helen barely recognized herself. You look wonderful, said the White House staff member assigned to accompany her. Are you ready? The car will be here in 15 minutes. Helen nodded, fingering the small pin attached to her lapel, her husband's military service emblem that she'd managed to keep with her even during her months on the street. I keep thinking I'll wake up and find myself back in that doorway, Helen admitted. This doesn't feel real. It's very real, the staff member assured her. And you've already made a difference. The VA has cleared over 500 backlogged cases in just 5 days. That's unprecedented. As their car approached the White House, Helen gazed out the window at the gathered press corps. Television trucks lined the street, and reporters stood ready with cameras and microphones. There are so many people, she whispered. Your story touched a nerve, Mrs. Thompson. It's not often we see such bipartisan support for anything these days. Inside the West Wing, President Trump was reviewing his remarks for the press conference when his chief of staff entered. Mrs. Thompson has arrived, sir. She's waiting in the Roosevelt room. Trump nodded, setting aside his notes. How is she holding up? Remarkably well, considering everything. She seems more concerned about helping others than her own situation. That doesn't surprise me, Trump replied, straightening his tie as he stood. Let's not keep her waiting. When Trump entered the Roosevelt room, Helen immediately tried to stand. A ripple of surprise moved through the press corps. No one had expected such rapid action. But fixing past mistakes isn't enough, Trump continued. Today, I'm signing an executive order establishing the Veterans Family Support Initiative, which will overhaul how benefits are processed and monitored. He outlined the key provisions: dedicated case managers for surviving spouses, streamlined verification procedures, and a new emergency housing fund specifically for veterans' families in crisis. And to ensure we never lose sight of the human impact of bureaucratic failure, I've asked Mrs. Thompson to serve as honorary chairperson of our Veterans Family Advisory Council. Helen looked up in surprise. This was the first she'd heard of this role. Mrs. Thompson, Trump said, turning toward her, would you like to say a few words? Hesitantly, Helen stepped to the microphone. The room fell completely silent. I'm not used to speaking to crowds, she began softly. A week ago, I was invisible. Just another homeless person that people walked past without seeing. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. My husband served this country proudly for over 2 decades. When he died, I thought the country he loved would remember him, would remember us. Instead, I fell through the cracks. But even in my darkest moments, I never lost faith that things could change. Helen paused, looking directly into the cameras. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone who served this nation or their families. If my story helps prevent even one veteran's spouse from spending a night on the street, then all of this, even the hard parts, will have been worth it. As Helen stepped back, spontaneous applause broke out among the normally reserved White House press corps. Trump signed the executive order as cameras captured the historic moment, then gently guided Helen through her first press questions. Later, as they walked back to the Oval Office, Trump asked, "Was that okay?" I should have warned you about the advisory role. Helen smiled. It was more than okay, Mr. President. For the first time in years, I feel like I have a purpose again. Trump nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most important changes. 6 months passed since that chilly morning in Chicago when President Trump stopped his motorcade for Helen Thompson. The world had largely moved on to other headlines, but the ripple effects of that chance encounter continued to spread far beyond what anyone could have predicted. On a bright spring morning, Helen stood at the podium in a community center in San Diego, addressing a room full of veterans and their families. Her appearance had changed dramatically since those days on the street, her silver hair neatly styled, her clothes simple but dignified, her posture straight and confident. 6 months ago, I had nowhere to call home, Helen began, her voice clear and steady now after dozens of similar talks across the country. Today, I'm proud to announce that the Veterans Family Support Initiative has helped over 3,000 families avoid the situation I found myself in. Applause filled the room as Helen gestured to a large screen showing the latest statistics. The program Trump had created following their encounter had expanded beyond anyone's expectations, turning into one of the most successful veterans support programs in recent history. The thing about bureaucracy, Helen continued, is that it's meant to serve people, not the other way around. Sometimes it takes one person stopping and really seeing the problem to make change happen. In the audience, a woman wiped away tears. Just weeks earlier, she had been facing eviction after her husband's VA benefits were delayed. The new rapid response team established under Helen's initiative had resolved her case in just 48 hours. After the presentation, as Helen chatted with attendees, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from the White House. The president wanted to speak with her that afternoon. Later, sitting in her modest but comfortable apartment, provided through the Veterans Housing Program, Helen took the call. Helen, it's Donald Trump. How was the San Diego event? It went very well, Mr. President. The room was full, and people are starting to see real results from the initiative. That's what I'm hearing from my team, Trump replied. The numbers are impressive. Veterans' homelessness down 18% in 6 months. Processing times for benefits cut in half. Helen smiled. It's making a real difference. Just yesterday, I met a woman who told me she and her children would be on the street if not for the emergency housing fund. There was a pause before Trump spoke again. Helen, I'm calling because we're approaching the 6-month anniversary of our meeting, and I'd like to do something special to highlight the progress. What did you have in mind, sir? Her return to where it all began. Next week, I'll be in Chicago again. I was thinking we could visit that same street corner, show people how one moment can lead to lasting change. Helen considered this. That would be powerful. I haven't been back there since that day. Would that be too difficult for you? Trump asked, his voice softening with genuine concern. No, Helen decided. It would be like closing a circle. I'd be honored. The following Tuesday, Helen found herself in a motorcade again, this time riding in the second vehicle behind the president. As they approached the downtown intersection where Trump had first noticed her, Helen felt a strange mix of emotions. This corner had once represented her lowest point. Now it symbolized a turning point not just for her, but for thousands of others. The motorcade stopped and security agents quickly secured the area. A small crowd had gathered behind barricades, having heard rumors of the president's visit. News cameras were already rolling as Trump stepped out of his vehicle, then waited for Helen to join him. Together, they walked to the exact doorway where Helen had once sought shelter. Someone had placed a small plaque there, unofficial but touching, the Helen Thompson moment, where one act of compassion changed a nation. Trump read it and nodded approvingly. Sometimes the most important presidential decisions aren't made in the Oval Office, he said, loud enough for the nearby microphones to catch. Helen stood quietly beside him, memories washing over her. It's strange to be back here, she admitted. I never imagined that morning would change everything. A reporter called out, Mrs. Thompson, how does it feel to return here after everything that's happened? Helen thought for a moment before answering. It feels like proof that no one is truly invisible. Even when you think the world has forgotten you, sometimes all it takes is one person to really see you. Trump placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The real credit goes to Helen, he told the gathered press. Her dignity in difficult circumstances, her willingness to share her story, and her tireless work since then has helped thousands of veteran families. As they prepared to leave, Helen spotted an elderly man in the crowd, his veteran's cap worn proudly despite his shabby clothes. Their eyes met, and Helen saw in his gaze the same quiet desperation she had once felt. She leaned toward Trump and whispered something. He listened, nodded, and then followed her gaze to where the man stood. Without hesitation, the president walked toward the barricade, Helen at his side. Secret Service agents tensed but followed closely as Trump approached the veteran. "Sir," Trump said, extending his hand, "I understand you served our country." The man stood straighter, almost at attention despite his age. "Yes, Mr. President. 2 tours in Vietnam." "We'd like to hear your story," Trump said simply. As the cameras captured this new, unexpected moment, Helen smiled. The cycle of compassion that had begun 6 months ago was continuing, proof that even in a divided nation, some things could still bring people together. One simple human connection had indeed shocked the world, not just because a president had stopped his motorcade, but because that moment had reminded everyone of a fundamental truth. Every person deserves to be seen, every story deserves to be heard, and sometimes the greatest leadership comes from the simplest acts of human kindness.